Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here. And on today's episode of Gear Curiosities, we are following up on the theme of vintage amp modeling hardware. So today we're going to be taking a look at basically the grandfather of them all, the original red kidney bean, the Line 6 Pod 1.0. With a history as storied and a reputation as polarizing as the Pods is, this thing really needs no introduction, though for the sake of completeness, I'll give a few fun facts and some history about this thing before we dive into the actual sounds and capability of this device. So, for my personal history with Line 6 in general, I'm not a Line 6 guy. I never owned a Line 6 product. This is actually the first Line 6 product I've ever bought, obviously used, if you can't tell. And every guitar player I knew my age at some point played a Line 6 product, it seems like, whether it be an actual pod, the HD 500, HD 300 series, or something of, that nature. I just always sat out on it because when I was looking at Line 6 products, they were either above what I wanted to spend when I was starting out, or by the time I had, kind of my ear fixed on some greater tones, then they were below what I wanted to spend. So they just kind of breezed right past them, which is a bit unfortunate because I think there's some good stuff out there. But taking it all the way back to 1998 when this thing originally launched, and I was still a toddler at that point and had no idea what amp modeling was or any intricacies of guitar playing in general, this thing was basically touted as Line 6 Amp Farm in a box. And many of you probably know Amp Farm today as Pod Farm. And back then it was kind of a basic plugin for Pro Tools to get the sort of VST plugin guitar tones that, I cover all the time on this channel today. And basically they took that same sort of technology that was built off of their earlier Flex Tone and other modeling amps and that software and put it into a desktop unit that you can, flip between effects and get 16 different amp model sounds. Later, the 2.0 added another 16, and they separated the cab modeling. But basically, everything I'm talking about in this video will apply to the 2.0. It's just the 2.0 has a few more toys to play with, so to speak. As far as I can gather, this unit launched at about $400 even. And to put that into perspective, in today's money, that's about $610 US. Some of the products you can get for $600 US, just to show the kind of evolution and what money buys you today, would include the Line 6 HX Stomp for $600, which is kind of their shrunk down Helix multi-effects unit. You can get the Atomic Amplifier now for like $500. I think it launched a little bit more expensive, but that's what they're running new. You can get a Pocket Pod, the shrunk down version of, I believe, 2.0 technology. Maybe it's XT, I can't remember. But it's one of the earlier gen pods, basically, and something about that big. You can buy that for $130. And let us not forget what is probably the biggest copycat product to this thing, the Behringer V-Amp, which you can buy the third generation of for $100 flat. So it's pretty interesting to see how much money buys you today compared to what it did then, the kind of quality, kind of features we get. But with that said, there's still quite a few modern aspects about this which make it super interesting. We'll certainly go into all those features. Before we take the physical tour of this product and listen to a few tones, I think it's important to understand what kind of bias I have towards this thing and the kind of ears I'm listening through and basically what I'm trying to accomplish with this video. As I've said, I've never been a Line 6 player, but I've always been rooting for them from the sidelines. I've always appreciated the kind of innovation they bring to the industry. In some of their stuff, it doesn't always sell as well. Sometimes it doesn't always, hit the right marks, but obviously they've found great success in the pods. And, some of my favorite albums were recorded with this exact technology or, later iterations of. For instance, the Pod XT era, Devin Townsend's Ziltoid was made entirely with Pod XTs. I want to say the first half dozen, something like that, albums and EPs from Monuments used the Pod XT. You've got Fear Factory, Animals as Leaders. Their first album was recorded with the X3, which is, a later generation of this. And that's also based off of Veta 2 architecture as far as I can tell. And for the Veta 2, I absolutely love Meshuggah's tones on Catch 33, the Nothing re-release in 2006, the IEP, and Obzin, and all of those were made with the Veta 2 head, and those are tones that you can, directly get on the X3s, just some different layouts as far as the signal chain goes, but otherwise pretty much identical sounds. So, I have an affinity for what Line 6 can make, but I just never, wanted to go out and buy one. So I thought it would be most logical, most interesting to begin at, well, the beginning. The few pieces of concrete experience I have going into this little review here were the handful of times I've tried the HD series. And that's a funny thing because I've seen so many cover bands use the HD 300 and HD 500 with pretty good success, whether it be country or, classic rock, not like super progressive metal, but decently heavy metal, and get some pretty good sounds for smaller venues. But every time I tried them, whether it was at Guitar Center or, local music shops where I had a few more minutes to play with them, I was not impressed. I fucking hated the fizzy, digitally, all the same complaints every tube purist complains about the Pod series. Chalk it up to bad presets, bad cabinet emulation, or I just didn't know how to use the damn thing, which is probably the real root cause here, considering my success with other modeling hardware. Then, I'm going in here with like a weird taste in my mouth. I have an aversion to it, but I have a love for the people that have used it right. So that's the kind of viewpoint I have going into this. So keep that in mind as I talk about my criticisms and what I like about this Line 6 Pod original. For the physical layout of this device, let's talk about input-output first, because it's just kind of strange. You take a normal rectangular stomp box or multi-effects unit and everything's either on the side or the top, and you can make everything tidy in a pedal board. But this wasn't designed for pedal boards, so you could technically do it. This was actually designed for either a desktop. They even made this crappy little mounting bracket thing that you can put on a mic stand or on between the handle of your amplifier. And it's probably a good thing they did that, because it's just some really strange decisions that I think they eventually fixed on later revisions of the Pod that weren't so exaggerated kidney bean shaped. I think like the X3 and HD are more heart shaped almost in the edges, so they can make this flatter. For starts, the input is over here, the headphone out is over here, which is kind of smart, because if you have it sitting on your table like that, you can just plop in your 1/4 inch in, and you've got, some compatible headphones, and everything's right there, and it's not, too cluttery. So that's pretty cool. Up top is where stuff starts getting a little strange. The power is there, which is convenient. The power in is right next to it. This is a proprietary power supply, which for a modern product, I would probably bitch to death over. Given it's 20, going on 21 years old now. Not so much, it's an inconvenience, and they're selling a lot of Pod originals and 2.0s without them, which is a bummer, but not too big of a deal. It's just a little bulky. And you have MIDI in and MIDI out, which is super cool. Not something I would have expected to see on this old of a product for, $400 back in the day, but really glad they included it. Something I will definitely be experimenting with in the future. In the top dead center, you have a standard RJ45 connection for the FB series of floorboard pedals. One of them has an expression pedal. I'm not sure if that actually works on the regular Pod. It does work on, I think, some of like the Flex Tone series of amps, that sort of thing. But if it does, you got a wah pedal. I've not really looked into it that much. And over here you have stereo outputs, which is pretty cool, because a lot of budget gear we've looked at even today is simply mono. So that's nice to have independent channels for both. In the middle, you have this direct and amp air mode switch. This is basically your cabinet emulation, though we'll certainly explore the success of that cabinet emulation, and more importantly to me, the success when it's turned off. And air is their proprietary cabinet room microphone modeling, though to me, I believe they're a little bit more intrinsically connected than something like a modern amp modeler where you can just simply turn off the impulse response and it sounds like a raw amp. Not so much with this, but again, we'll get into that. On the front, starting on the left and going clockwise, we have the amp model selection. This is a collection of 16 different modeled amplifiers and cabinets. In this model, unlike the 2.0, when you select the amp model, you're also selecting the cabinet they chose for it. Although on the 2.0, I think you can hold tap tempo and switch the models using the effects version for the cabs at least. Not exactly a feature I really miss all that much. And you also have more amp models to play with. But on this, you've got everything from a few proprietary pod, virtual models. You've got stuff like the Vox AC15. You got the Fender, Bassman. You've got some JTM 45 stuff. You got some Plexi stuff, JCM 800, dual rectifier. I think the modern high gain is a Soldano. And some random stuff like a Fuzzbox 2 preamp. Even considering the 2.0's extended lineup, that's a pretty good selection of amps for 1998. There's really no other way you're going to get those sort of sounds without having all the real amplifiers or some sort of handcrafted stomp box that it's going to emulate the preamp circuit of that. So pretty damn cool that you can get that much into something of this size at that time. For the other controls, you got output level, which you're going to want to dime as much as possible. You'll be balancing that with some of the other controls. You got drive, which is driving the front end of the amp for how much dirt is coming out. Bass middle treble. Unlike later pods, the presence is absent, which is a bit unfortunate because I find you really have to crank the treble on some of these amp models and it just doesn't sound as good as I would want it to if you had presence enabled. The channel volume is the control that you'll be tweaking in tandem with the output level. Say, you can crank both without clipping on one of the clean models, but if you switch to, say, the rectifier, then you might have to dial it back just a little bit to keep it from clipping, and it'll tell you if it is. Then you got a reverb control, just one dedicated knob. You can't change anything about it. It's just how much is it there. Good enough, I suppose. And then effect tweak, which does different stuff depending on which effect you use. So in the effects bank, you've got a combination of quite a few. You've got 2 choruses, 2 flangers, a delay, a rotary, a tremolo, compressor, and then over here you can actually combine a few of them. So like delay compressor, delay chorus, delay flanger, delay swell, delay tremolo, basically delay whatever else. For the effects tweak for like delay, that's how long it it sits in the mix. The chorus is how much depth you have. Tremolo is depth. Compressor is how much is it compressing. And then for the time-based effects like the chorus and delay, you'll actually use tap tempo to set the timing on it. So you can't separate the two, which is something that I think we take for granted on modern amp modelers, where you'll say, oh, I want the chorus at 2 hertz or 0.65 hertz, but I want delay to be set here on every quarter note. Not happening on this thing, though. Did you really expect it to? Next to the tap tempo, we have the noise gate, which is actually pretty good, all things considered. It's certainly more usable than even a lot of modern built-in noise gates, and it's better left on than off. So kind of impressed by that, to tell you the truth. We have a built-in tuner, which isn't amazing, but it is built in. That would have saved me a pedal, back then, which is kind of cool. Not terribly accurate. The resolution isn't all that good, and it certainly doesn't handle extended range guitars very well. It also takes some time to come on and turn back off, but if you're not using it in a really fast-paced situation, it's not that big of a deal. Over here is where you would save your presets. If you dial in something you like, you could turn on MIDI functionality there to accept program changes from the in. Manual mode tells the pod to go back to whatever settings you have dialed in on its face. So say you were using a preset with the pod clean model and everything was at noon, but you hit manual and you're actually at, here, Brit high gain, your output's cranked, all these settings are there. It will respond and go back to, whatever you got dialed in there. And then up and down you use to select whatever preset. And that's it. It's pretty simple, really easy actually, and intuitive, which I think is good considering the time frame it came out. You couldn't have too big of a learning curve for a lot of people that never heard of amp modeling. This kind of introduced that sort of vernacular into guitarist vocabulary. So it's kind of fun to use. It's refreshing almost to be introduced to something that has so few options and you're forced to stay there. Unlike, modern fractal or even modern Line 6 modeling hardware where you can tweak every little parameter and change stuff about the amp architecture and And you just can't on here, and it's kind of cool because you just flip to something and go, oh, that sounds good, and you play. So for better or for worse, it is what it is. So with that, let's take a listen to the clean and low gain amp models. We'll be phasing in and out some of these time-based effects, see how they pair. The reverb will be showcased on pretty much every amp model. That does change depending on what you're using, so you've got room for a lot of these, although on the classic type amps you actually have a spring reverb, so be sure to demo that and see what kind of sounds we can get out of it. I was personally really impressed with the cleans and low gain sounds, as well as the effects, because even 10, 12 years ago on my budget rigs, I would have killed for that sort of functionality, that sort of versatility and quality. It is process sounding by today's standards. It doesn't have the, you know, kind of realistic breakup that tube amps do, and you know, there's some artifacts here and there, but just for jamming and gigging, it's still usable. Like, it's crazy how, you know, good this still sounds in that regard. The effects are pretty damn usable as well, if not, you know, a little bland by today's standards, because you can't tweak a lot of this stuff. But I can just imagine 20, 21 years ago getting one of these things for someone that has never really heard that sort of guitar tone come out of their rig, especially if you just had some crappy solid state amp you bought from a pawn shop and maybe a stomp box or two, and then you plug into one of these things and it's like, holy shit, I can actually kind of sound like my Guitar Heroes. So definitely a lot of points for this device on the cleans and crunch. Pretty impressive. What always separates the big dogs from the rest of the pack, though, even on today's modern amp modelers, is without a doubt the high gain amps. And this does fall short in one key area that I do miss from later pod models. That is, there's no stomp box modeling before the amp section, meaning that if you want to drive the front end of these amps with a tube screamer or a clean boost, you better have an actual tube screamer or a clean boost. So that's kind of a bummer. And these just kind of sound like shit without a boost. They're usable, especially for leads. Like, it does work to have that kind of fat sound, but for rhythm playing, it just doesn't work, simply put. So to help it out a little bit, I will be using a clean boost for some of the classic models and a super overdrive for some of the modern stuff, just to, you know, tighten up the bass response and show, you know, what this thing is actually capable of. It's just unfortunate you do have to have outboard gear to make it get the sounds that we will be showing here. So without further ado, here's some more high gain stuff. As expected, I wasn't exactly blown away by the high gain amp models. Stuff like the Brit Classic and the high gain just don't sound all that Marshall-y to me. It sounds like a solid state amp trying to sound like a Marshall, which is a bit unfortunate. The rectifier model, though, was pretty damn usable. I was kind of impressed by it. It sounds different. It doesn't sound as authentic as the real deal, but compared to something like the Moore 011, which is a $100, preamp pedal with its own built-in cabinet emulation, it sounds pretty damn close to that in quality. Not exactly, but better than it probably should be considering this thing's age. Wasn't terribly keen on the Soldano model, probably usable with some post EQ, whatever. The fuzz box is fun, but again, not something that's really all up my alley. So the rectifier is the one I would probably stick with out of the bunch, and it would be interesting to hear some of like the Mark II C+ drive channels they have on the 2.0, but overall, it's okay again for that sort of process sound, and something that I would have loved to play through 10, 12 years ago. It's just not quite up to today's standards. Can you blame it though, with how old it is? So everything you've heard up until now is direct. This is everything built in, but they do tout that this thing can do quite a few other use cases. So for these demos, we're going to be going into the amp mode. That will disable the internal cabinet and microphone modeling and allow us to put this thing through, say, the effects return of a real tube amp in a 4x12, and we're going to do just that. Through a stereo solid state power amp powering a stereo 2x12. We're going to be doing just that to hear, if the stereo effects kind of translate into an open room. And finally, for shits and giggles, we're going to record this thing both with the built-in cabs as well as disabled cabs, and then throw some impulse responses over top and see if we can get some more usable tones for modern recorded sounds. And to really punish it, we're going to put an 8-string and a Fort and Grind into it, just for because. Some pretty interesting results in that batch of demos as well. Starting with the actual amp in the room use case, the stereo 2x12 was pretty cool. It didn't sound all that authentic, though it was more than serviceable for practicing and jamming applications and that sort of thing. And I think you'd be hard pressed back in '98 to get that sort of variety in sound, that sort of flexibility for $400. So it's kind of hard to criticize too much in terms of its power and in terms of its sound quality. So I enjoyed it. It just wasn't, the real deal experience. It kind of felt like playing through a toy, though it was still, quite a bit of fun. Through the effects return of a tube amp, that's where stuff started to liven up a little bit. But, especially comparing the rectifier model to the real rectifier preamp, it's again like playing through a cheap Chinese knockoff. It just doesn't really have the body or the warmth or dynamics or any of those other buzzwords that tube purists like to throw out, because it's kind of true. It just doesn't. It sounds a little sterile. And in those demos, you can kind of hear there's almost like this muffled type of, layering over top of the amp modeling, because no matter how much you crank up the treble and mids, it sounds like there's a low pass and a high pass filter on it that is reminiscent of something like the emulated cabinet output of a cheaper amplifier that doesn't actually have any impulse response convolution going on. It's just an EQ curve, and it kind of sounds like that. Like there's something still baked in the amp models that make it not play quite as well with real gear compared to a lot of modern preamp digital modeling stuff. So that's a bit unfortunate. And then we get into the recording application, and I thought both just kind of sounded like shit, to tell you the truth. The stock cab was just not good, double tracked, very boxy, very boomy, very much, again, that sort of direct output type thing with no impulse response, although supposedly they are using some sort of more advanced modeling. And then turning off all that modeling, putting a third-party IR over it, actually took me a while to get something that was even that usable, because this doesn't play well with modern impulse responses, whether it be because stuff like the Helix or the Kemper or the Fractal Axe Effects units do kind of their own response in terms of resonance and presence and all that sort of thing in the power amp section, and this probably doesn't. Throwing a regular own hammer or red wires over top of this model just sounded so flat, so dull, to the point that I actually had to break out some of my free impulse responses that kind of have some of that stuff baked in that works really well with freeware, and got a bit of a better result out of it, but still hardly impressive. I certainly wouldn't use it even on a demo. So yeah, definitely not your diamond in the rough cheap recording solution. And even if that sounded good, I still wouldn't recommend it for that, since you need to boost the high gain models anyway. But it's interesting to see how far we've come in terms of recording quality with freeware and some of the other, competition in the amp modeling market. So to wrap up my analysis and get into some conclusions, the cleans, the effects, pretty damn impressive for its age. I would have no problem plugging into this thing and just jamming some lower gain tones just to do it. It sounds good. I put quite a few hours into this already just because it is that enjoyable. And you throw a decent drive pedal in front and you can make a lot of these high gain amps usable. They're not quite as, fun to play, quite as authentic feeling as a lot of modern products are, but they're still okay. And you're certainly not going to get Axe Effects or even modern Line 6 Pod HD sounds out of this thing recording. I think that is completely off the table, even with the 2.0. Maybe you can get something a little better if you change the cabinet models, but certainly not impressed with that. And all those things make it a product of its time. But still, I was pleasantly surprised by a lot of the features on here. Some weird layout decisions, some weird features that maybe don't translate to a modern day design, but a lot of stuff that I would like to see carry over. As most of you probably know, I absolutely love to tweak amplifiers and effects when I'm in the mood for it. Making an AX8 patch video or doing these sort of demos, it's really interesting and fun to see just how much you can push out of your gear, how much, a little bitty hair turn can make the difference from flat and, unimpressive to a huge booming guitar sound. But that's when I'm in the mood for it. And when I just want to play, the last thing I want to do is turn a bunch of dials. Because it's just not inspiring. By the time I spend 15-20 minutes getting the sound I want, I'm no longer in the mood to jam. So for that reason, I end up pulling a lot of my presets up that I've already made. I put my amp, all their knobs and EQ positions, everything in the positions I know that work, and the ones that I've basically memorized, and then just start playing, and that's done. And this thing scratches that same sort of itch that I don't think modern pods do, which is unfortunate. And for that reason, I would love to see kind of a simplified, dumbed down version of a modern pod that is this easy, this accessible to tweak. And I don't know exactly how you would do that to, include all the things I would want, because I'd love to have a presence knob. I'd love to have stop box modeling in here, but I think the Pod XT just might do that for me. And, maybe we'll check that out in the future, but I love the concept. I love the simplicity, and I really like being limited on options when I'm in the mood for it, because this is one of those, you just turn it and that's your sound. Hope you like it, because that's all you're going to get. And it's refreshing. It's kind of cool coming from, all these modelers and real gear that you can spend the rest of your life going through different presets and never being satisfied. So I do enjoy that part of it. All in all, I would have killed for this exact piece of gear 10 or 12 years ago. I mean, it needs some help, but the versatility, the quality compared to a lot of the stock boxes and like the Korg AX5G we took a look at is just super impressive for its age, and it probably would have still, you know, costed quite a bit more money back then. But yeah, I think it really speaks to the quality of engineering and you know, kind of the 80 for 20 rule of amp modeling, I guess, because, you know, you hear like the Tweed, you hear the Fender Blackface model, you hear the rectifier, and you can kind of go, oh, that's pretty damn close. Like I can see that. That sounds like a rectifier, but it takes exponentially more processing power, more complexity in the algorithm to go from that's pretty close to indistinguishable in the room or in a mix. And that's kind of where we're at today. So for its power and its price on the used market, this thing certainly punches above its weight class, but it's definitely not one I would recommend for most people. It is a cool vintage piece of gear to have, and for that reason, I would recommend about anything else for someone that is actually looking to seriously jam. Though if you've got an old one lying around and say your kid is getting into playing guitar, then it's not a bad starter device. The next generation XT probably wouldn't be a bad place to start for a lot of people on an extreme budget, because it does introduce stop box modeling, which would, you know, eliminate the need for an external overdrive. You can move stuff about the signal chain, which is you know, one of those features that takes away the plug and play nature of the original, but it's a trade-off that, you know, is probably going to be a lot more useful once you get it set up and you can just switch between presets. There are some fans of the original pod that say the XTs don't sound as good, which is a possibility, but there are a lot of recorded tones I really enjoy from the XT series. So I'd like to get my hands on one eventually and check it out. And there's practically zero chance I would ever use this feature as my daily driver, but maybe I would for a cover or one-off, something like that, is the USB connection can actually be used as an audio interface. So you've got your guitar modeling and, you know, real-time interface on one, which means you don't have to buy one of those. So pretty damn good value if all you're gonna do is, you know, record guitars and are just kind of getting into the recording scene, I think. You know, because otherwise you're going to be spending $100-ish and be loading up a bunch of plugins. So, you know, not a bad premise. Overall, I am really glad I got to play through this legendary piece of gear and own it. And I really hope in the future Line 6 takes that iconic pod brand and does a little bit more with it in the lower to middle budget area. I think they could do really great stuff with it and provide even more competition, which is good for us at the end of the day. So that'll be about that. If you have any questions, comments, as always, leave them below. If you have an old pod bean-shaped, I'm not interested in the rack units or the floorboards, that you'd like to lend or sell cheap, then let me know, because this was pretty fun, and a, you know, generation to generation shootout would be a pretty damn cool pedal head, although we do have one coming up for this. And that will about do it. Thanks for watching this episode of Gear Curiosities. We will see you next time. Bye.